Hello and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. These are online lectures, and this is the first lecture, an overview of what is psychology, basically. And we are going to discuss the nature of psychology today. Let us begin by a quick overview of the course book itself, the first chapter, basically pages from 2 to 31, and there are quite a lot of keywords that is sort of a good way to structure your knowledge based upon. So let's begin by the first big chapter, the scope of psychology. Reading. What if I gave you a pizza for each chapter you read in your textbook? And I'm not kidding. Well, I might be. Read for pizza. This was a big and still is a big, campaign of Pizza Hut, basically having a note of children reading some books and reinforcing this wonderful activity with pizzas. Yay! It might seem a good idea, and based on the law of a fact, it should work, right? If I'm reinforcing a behavior, the behavior will be strengthened based on the behavioralist view of psychology, and thus this will lead to more reading. Well, not necessarily, because reading on the long run should be mediated by basically intrinsic interests coming from the inside of children. Thus, if you reinforce reading by external factors, chocolate, pizza, etc., too much, then this might in fact decrease the reading enthusiasm. And this has been proven by many experiments. Some of them are in your textbook with interesting mathematical problems that were given to children with a experimental versus control group design. We will learn about that on today's lecture. And the outcome is definitely highlighting the overjustification effect. That bastard, that unfaithful bastard, it's in his nature. That's just his personality. He does that all the time, right? Well, the fundamental attribution error explains this in a way that this feeling of that bastard, that we might overestimate the inner personal characteristics of an individual person and his responsibilities if this negative happening is done by somebody else. On the other hand, if I do the same, if I'm unfaithful, then this is not the case, then it's circumstantial that the whole thing happened, right? It's not me, it's the circumstances. Okay, let's look at this other case, a man who mistook his wife for a hat. There's a famous book on this. How could this have happened? And why my mouse is not working correctly. So, clinical cases of face blindness, those people who kind of see everything except the faces, they see the faces but they don't recognize it, is a psychological function that's linked to a specific brain area. Please check out this little link. I will give it to you as a link in the under the YouTube video. And it's the fusiform gyrus that has to do with this specific case, clinically described as prosopagnosia, a loss of ability to recognize faces specifically. Just imagine how one can live like this, not recognizing who is who. And we will come back to this face recognition interesting problem in another lecture related to perception later on. Some other issues in psychology. How did we lose 3 whole years from our past? Everybody loses these first 3 years. It's called childhood amnesia, and it's basically the inability to recall events from the first 3 years of life. How to test this? They, for example, collect a number of university students and ask about the birth of their sisters or brothers. Of course, they would have to have a sister or brother who was born sometime when they were from year 1 to year 3 or even more. What they find is that if they were already 4 years old when their sister or brothers were born, then they can remember specific events. On the other hand, if they were younger, 3 or less, then they cannot recall any of these events. If they can, that's probably a rehearsed memory, something that has been told to them many, many times. And that's a different issue, but let's not go into that right now. How to lose weight? Well, there are better and worse ways to do it. Probably starving is not the best idea because our system will act upon this event and change the whole metabolism in order to keep anything that's possible to gain, to maintain our weight that has already been set. Again, we will get back to this point in the homeostatic discussions later in later lectures. Also, it's a good idea to know what obese means, and it's written here, right here, and is pictured right here in the middle. Watching aggression, media violence when you're 9 might result in more aggressive behaviors when you're 19. This is also interesting results from a study that has been conducted with longitudinally, so people were assessed 10 years apart, and the percent of aggressive behavior in this epsilon axis 10 years later than the actual viewing of violence, of course these were surveys, these were questionnaire methods, shows a very clear association. So there's some links between these two that might be explained by the cathartic effect. Okay, so after these few highlights from psychology and psychological research, let's walk along the path of historical origins of psychology. First, I might mention the ancient medical concept of Homerism, highlighting the concept that the overflow of a certain liquid in the system might result in specific personality outcomes, like phlegmatic people who won't care at all. Well, these views might be very catching, but modern physiological experiments don't show any good relations with these ancient assumptions of Homerism. Nonetheless, physiology is the study of functions in the living organism and its parts. And today, for example, emotional happenings are linked to certain physiological happenings in the body. So this is very similar yet different from this ancient medical concept. Nature or nature was a big debate along the way, And I will explain this in detail in the behavioral genetic classes later on, or right now, depending on which year you're taking these classes. Nonetheless, it's a good idea to read a little bit about the nature view, the nurture view, the tabula rasa, how we're an empty page, how we are born, and that empty page is being written along the way with our experiences. I would suggest nature and nurture, as you've heard from me, or you will hear from me many times. And I might point out Descartes, who has this interesting idea that the way we work resembles any machine. And that's also a good way to examine how the psyche and humans work. Some important dates, for example, 1879 is the beginning of scientific psychology with the famous thinker Wilhelm Wundt, who has established experimental psychology in those times. Introspection was one of the most important ways to examine the inner workings of the human mind, just like you can examine by viewing the stars or other constructs of nature. Let's move on to the different fields of psychology, and this is a very good concept review table with 5 different perspectives within psychology. Also, the fields are linked to these perspectives, and please read them from the book. And also, it's a very good idea if during your studies you kind of have a choice for your own taste how you would like to consider psychological happenings and the study of these happenings. These perspectives are very different. A biological perspective will always concentrate on measuring something in the brain, whereas in behavioral psychology, you will concentrate on conducting experiments. The psychoanalytic perspective is very, very different from all of these. So it's like cooking. Everybody has his own favorite taste, yet the things and the psychological constraints that they're explaining are very, very similar. Research methods in psychology is our last but not least of the topics, and it's quite important to find proof, truth, facts, to work with empirical methods when we are trying to prove hypotheses that we have been setting up. Many of the things that I will show here will link us to the statistic classes, but it's not a problem. These main concepts and terms are important for both of these subjects, so please review them and learn them along the way. So hypothesis, experiment, variable, independent, dependent variable, and all the different groups and assignments, measurement and statistics are what I'm talking about. And let's see some examples and some summaries of what are these. This is a reminder. We've already followed up on the basic concept of empirical studies, starting with defining what is our observational units. And remember, they can be anything from a chair to subjects. Those are the most sort of frequent observational units. A sample is a few or a bunch of these that we select that we can actually measure. But when we're drawing conclusion based on our sample, we're always talking about the population, all of our observational units. I also reminded you that you have to be careful to choose your observational units randomly enough in order to be able to talk about the population. For example, we cannot draw general conclusions for university students if we've just studied a single class in a single university. Then we have to be more specific about the population we're talking about. For example, ELUP students studying in Hungary. Variables are simply features of the observational units, and these can be, again, anything from state, trait, anxiety characteristics to the color of a book or sex of the person who is partaking in the study. And our aim is very clear. We take data based on the sample, we do some voodoo with statistics, and we want to draw our conclusions to the population that we're talking about. Let's highlight some other issues. For example, reliability and validity are two very important concepts. Please check them in the glossary. And also let me highlight this with a very good example. Let's pretend that we're playing darts and I'm throwing the darts and I'm not very good at it. In fact, I'm making these dots on sample A all along. My shoots were not reliable. I was shooting all over and definitely not valid. Why? Because I aimed for the center and these are not in the center. Let's see number B. Am I being reliable? Yes, I'm quite reliably throwing somewhere which is not the center. So I'm not being valid. I'm not, getting the aim that I was working on. And obviously, picture C is the good solution where the measurement that I'm depicting here with the darts is reliable and valid. So basically, reliability is the how. Am I doing well what I'm intending to do? Yes, here, even in B, I'm doing quite well, but I'm not doing what was intended. So the validity part is the what. And let's talk a little bit about experiments and how to conduct experiments. For example, research question and hypothesis are very important in this respect, and many students ask me, okay, should it be a question? Should it be a statement? Well, sometimes it's a question. This is typically a research question, but when I have an opinion about it, for example, I kind of feel that in English it's much easier, shorter to name objects than in Hungarian. Well, the cause is another issue, but that's my bet. Then I can conduct an experiment. I have subjects name pictures in both English and Hungarian. And I probably, if my hypothesis is correct, then I will find average reaction times being smaller for English words or English namings as compared to Hungarian names. When planning an experiment, it's very important to carefully think over all the steps that you will take along the way, starting with experimental group versus control groups, how we put people in these groups, and random assignment is one basic factor in it. Which is our independent variable from the variable list, and what are dependent variables? Basically, independent variable is the thing that is hypothesized to cause the actual effects. For example, in my example here, it's definitely language that would be the independent variable, whereas the dependent variable would be reaction time, the measured effect. Also, please review measurement, statistics. What is statistically significant? We didn't learn about that just yet in the statistic classes, but we will. And let's see some more examples. So there's my hypothesis. There are language differences in picture naming speed of simple objects. Same hypothesis as before. Probably I'm going to choose 2 languages. But how? Remember I said plan your experiments very carefully. How should I do that? Should I choose 2 independent groups, for example, a group of Chinese people and a group of Bulgarian people, and I show them the same picture as I showed you before, the dog, and then I will have a case variable matrix where I have independent samples, okay, and I'm going to compare the reaction time of the 2 languages, the average reaction time. This is one aspect, how we could do it. What is the problem here? Well, there might be people in the Chinese group that are more, let's say, faster, not because of the language, because just, by accident. So that's a problem. That the main differences of the groups might influence my actual study. Let's pick another way, a methodology to do it. We could do multiple measurements. We could take multiple measurements from the same group. For example, we have just a single set of people who speak Chinese and Bulgarian. Good luck finding them. That's for example, one flaw of this type of methodology. But now here we could have the same set of subjects and reaction time in Bulgarian and Chinese, comparing again the average reaction time but within a dependent design as compared to an independent design. We will learn about this much more when we cover the t-test in statistics. And also a little bit about multivariate experiments. So when we have more than one independent variables. For example, let's take a study where they took Rorschach test answers. And what are these? This is a card. What is this? The experimenter says, and the subject goes, oh, it's 2 girls carrying, I don't know, something. And then this is, let's say, a man. And then this is a bat, a typical answer for this card. These are 2 pixies, joined somehow. And this is leaves on a tree, for example. This is a card that typically nobody can describe well. Well, I haven't said a single sex response, probably because, I was thinking about how this study examined sex-related responses. And, well, you can recognize the tits, obviously, with the girls and something in the middle on this picture. And people see something up here, who knows what. And down here, again, who knows what, typically. And they see, those who see sex responses here see it all over the place. Okay, so the study hypothesized that males would produce more sex-related Rorschach answers. And the result says, no, this is not true. Again, the hypothesis says those with lower education will definitely produce more sex-related Rorschach answers. And the answer is no, they don't. However, even though these are 2 definite no's for our original hypothesis, in multivariate experiments, you can always examine interactions. And here it has been found that a very interesting interaction effect occurred. Those males with higher education than the rest, and those females with lower education than the rest produced the most sex-related answers to Rorschach tests. So here, interaction is a new aspect that you might consider in multivariate experiments. Also, all along, we've been talking about effects and causes. Sometimes there are no causes, there are only associations. I redeemed the famous breakfast theory. I will talk about this more again in the statistics class, but here I might just say that those children who eat breakfast at home are smarter, are better on their education, etc., etc. Why is that? Does breakfast has this enchanting effect on the children? Well, no. Probably this is just an association. Probably the cause is something else in the background, like parents who really care for the future of their children, etc., etc. So definitely it's not the breakfast, it's just an outcome of the same effect, the breakfast and the education. So when we're talking about correlation, we might consider positive. This was evidently a positive relationship, but there's negative or no relationship. And this scatter plot is how we picture correlation, association. And again, this is just a highlight of how our data will go into the actual graphs, and we will have some points for hours of studying and mean of the grades of these people. And once we have a scatter, a group of bunch of dots, we can always find a line that describes these dots the best. And that's our regression line, and that's how we set up our positive or negative or non-existing relation. Some other methods apart from experiments, tests and surveys, a very, very interesting way of asking people's opinions and seeking out their temperament and personality and their resilience, their optimistic, pessimistic views, etc., etc. Questionnaire methods are the essence of psychology, yet we do have to consider some important facts. For example, the desirability effect. If somebody is put to the stage and is asked while many are viewing, the opinions and the statements might not come from his or her inner self, but he or she might say what the crowd wants to hear. And that's very general, especially when we are having these surveys done on famous universities that expect good answers. Then, people behave in a silently different ways. And I will explain about this a little bit more along the way in other lectures. A good alternative might be observation and case histories. Well, those are very, very, again, very fruitful and very widely used methods for animal behavior and especially child behavior. But again, there are some problems with observation. For example, observers might already have an opinion. Thus, observations, when written down, might have some bias. Case histories are simply very specific cases that might not apply to everyone. Still, these are very important methods. Please learn them. And who wouldn't want to read? Literature reviews, both narrative reviews and meta-analysis, are a very good way to seek out how others think and have written about certain problems or facts. And last but not least, let's talk about ethical issues and principles. The three main principles to, as a basic, as an essence of how we can and must conduct experiments. First of all, whenever planning an experiment, you have to consider minimal risks. Of course, the lowest risk possible is the best. Let's say you want to examine stress, but how to induce stress? Well, certain musics or videos might be a good idea, but you cannot increase this risk higher than one would experience in everyday life. Thus, the minimal risk principle. Also, people have to be told what's going to happen to them. You have to give a written, informed material that explains all about the experiment, and people have to actually sign it. So this is called informed consent. They give their written consent to something that has been well explained to them. And sometimes it's a problem that you cannot explain everything because you would ruin your sort of deceitful experimental point. In this case, post-experiment debriefing is an essential thing to do, and it has to be done well by somebody who knows what he or she is talking about. Also, the right to privacy as an ethical principle states that their actual data can be handled in very specific ways. Ready for a challenge? I suggest that you read the material, look through this lecture, and then try to do this summary practice task and discuss these questions with your classmates. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you on the next lecture.